I was not asked if I agreed to the marriage. I was simply told it was already decided. Those were the exact words I heard the moment my entire life stopped feeling like my own. The room was too quiet, too expensive, and too controlled, like everything inside it had been designed to remind me I had no real place in it. I stood in the center of a large private office overlooking Chicago, my hands pressed tightly against the edges of a document I was not supposed to question. The marriage contract. My name was already printed on it, clean and final, as if my consent had been assumed long before I ever entered the room. Across from me stood Adrian Cole. He did not look surprised by my silence. He looked like someone observing a predictable outcome. Dark tailored suit, calm posture, expression unreadable. He was not the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "This arrangement is not emotional," one of the advisors said from the side of the room, as if reading policy rather than discussing a human life. "It is structural. Financial stability. Family alignment. Long-term protection." I almost laughed, but it came out as something smaller, something sharper. "Protection," I repeated quietly. My voice sounded too calm for what I felt inside. No one answered me directly. That was the moment I realized I was not part of a conversation. I was part of a decision already made. I looked down at the contract again. Every line felt heavier than ink should ever feel. Every clause was a boundary I had never agreed to cross. My fingers tightened around the paper without me realizing it. "I am not signing this," I said. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was absolute. A slight shift moved through the room. Not panic. Not surprise. More like recalculation. Adrian finally spoke. His voice was steady, controlled, almost quiet. "You already understand what refusing means," he said. I lifted my eyes to him immediately. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" I asked. He did not answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, just enough to close the distance between authority and defiance without breaking it. "It means," he said, "you are not refusing me. You are refusing the structure that made this necessary." That answer unsettled me more than any threat could have, because it did not sound like persuasion. It sounded like certainty. I looked around the room again. The advisors were still watching. No one intervened. No one questioned. That was when I understood something even more uncomfortable. This was not being negotiated. It was being executed. I looked back at Adrian. "If I tear this up," I said slowly, holding the contract tighter, "what happens then?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Not frustration. Something closer to interest. "Then," he said calmly, "you show me who you really are when nothing is controlling your choice." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. I looked down at the paper again. My name. His name. A future written without my voice. And in that moment I made my decision. I tore it. The sound was sharper than I expected in a room that expensive, too real for something so symbolic. Paper split cleanly in my hands. For a fraction of a second nobody moved. Not the advisors. Not the security standing near the door. Not even Adrian. I let the pieces fall to the floor between us. My breathing was steady, but everything inside me was not. I expected anger. I expected consequences. I expected something immediate. Instead, Adrian simply looked at the torn pieces on the ground, then slowly lifted his gaze back to me. His expression did not harden. It deepened. "Lock the door," he said quietly. The words were not loud, but they changed the entire room. The click that followed was soft, almost polite, but the meaning behind it was not. And in that sealed silence, I realized the moment I thought I had ended something, I had only just begun it. The sound of the door locking behind me was soft, but it changed the atmosphere in a way I could not ignore. It was not dramatic. It was final in a quieter sense, like a sentence that does not need emphasis to be understood. I stood still, my hands still slightly trembling from what I had just done, watching the torn pieces of the contract settle on the floor between us. No one moved. Immediately. Not the advisors who were still present. Not the security at the edge of the room. And especially not Adrian Cole. He did not look at the door. He did not look at the others. His focus remained on me. That silence was heavier than any argument I could have made. I forced myself to speak first. Why did you lock it? I asked. My voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath it. Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly toward the center of the room, his steps controlled, deliberate, as if time itself was something he refused to rush. Because you made a decision, he said finally. I frowned slightly. I tore up a contract. That is not a reason to trap someone in a room. One of the advisors shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. Adrian raised a hand slightly, and even that small gesture was enough to quiet the space again. You think this is about trapping you, he said calmly. It is not. I let out a short breath of disbelief. Then what is it about? He stopped a few feet away from me, maintaining distance, not invading space but not allowing escape either. It is about consequences, he said. The word landed differently than I expected. Not as punishment, as structure. I looked down at the torn paper again. My choice was real. I had felt it in my hands. But now I was beginning to understand that choices inside systems like this did not disappear. They only shifted direction. You are saying tearing that contract has consequences? I asked. Everything has consequences, he replied. His tone did not change. No anger. No irritation. Just certainty. I looked around the room again, trying to understand the logic I had just stepped into. So what happens now? I asked. For the first time, something subtle changed in Adrian's expression. Not softness. Not aggression. Something closer to evaluation. Now, he said. You stop thinking this was ever just paperwork. I crossed my arms instinctively, trying to regain control of myself. Then what was it? I asked. Adrian turned slightly, glancing briefly at the torn contract on the floor. A boundary, he said. A controlled arrangement designed to protect multiple interests, including yours. That sentence made my stomach tighten, not because it sounded threatening, but because it sounded too calm to be a lie. Protect me from what exactly? I asked immediately. He did not answer right away. That pause was the first time I felt something like uncertainty from him, though it was subtle. From situations you have not been exposed to yet, he said finally. I stared at him. That is not an answer. It is the only one you need right now, he replied. The advisors remained silent, as if they understood the limits of what could be said in this moment. I took a slow step back, not toward escape but toward understanding. If this was about protection, I said, why not tell me before forcing a contract on me? Adrian's gaze remained steady. Because you would not have believed it, he said simply. I exhaled slowly, realizing how trapped that logic felt. Not physically, mentally. I looked at the locked door behind me for a moment, then back at him. So where does that leave me now? I asked. Adrian did not move closer. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, inside the truth you just forced open. And in that moment I understood that the door he locked was not meant to keep me inside the room. It was meant to make sure I could not leave what I had already begun to see. The silence in the locked room did not break immediately. It settled deeper instead, as if the space itself was adjusting to the fact that nothing could leave until everything was understood. I stood where I was, still processing what Adrian had just said, feeling the weight of his words rather than their volume. Inside the truth you just forced open. That sentence kept repeating in my mind, not as an explanation, but as a warning I did not fully understand yet. I looked at him again, trying to find something familiar in his expression, something that would allow me to categorize this moment as normal, or at least understandable. There was nothing normal about it. You keep saying I forced this open, I said finally. My voice was quieter now, less defensive, more uncertain. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead, he moved toward the table where the torn contract still lay scattered. He picked up a single piece, not to repair it, but to observe it briefly before placing it back down. You made a choice that disrupted a controlled arrangement, he said. That is not the same as forcing truth, but it creates exposure. I frowned slightly. Exposure to what? He turned back toward me. To the structure behind it. I exhaled slowly, crossing my arms again, but this time more out of habit than resistance. You are talking like there is something bigger behind all of this, I said. But no one ever explained anything to me before forcing me into it. For the first time, something almost like acknowledgement passed through his expression, though it was subtle and brief. "That is correct," he said. I blinked. "So you admit it?" "I am not denying it," he replied. The simplicity of his honesty made it harder, not easier, to argue. I walked a few steps away from him, needing distance to think clearly, even though the room itself did not allow escape. The locked door was still there behind me, quiet and unchanged. "If this is about protection," I said slowly, "then why does it feel like control?" Adrian watched me without interruption. "Because protection inside systems like this often requires boundaries that feel restrictive to those who are inside them," he said. I shook my head slightly. That sounds like justification, not explanation. He did not react defensively. Instead, he nodded once, as if accepting the limitation of language itself. "It is both," he said. I stopped walking and turned back toward him. "You are saying I was never meant to understand any of this until now," I said. "Until I broke something." Adrian's gaze remained steady. "You were never meant to be inside it without awareness," he corrected. The distinction between those two statements lingered in my mind. I looked at the floor again, at the torn contract, still scattered in pieces that no longer represented agreement, but also no longer represented nothing. "So what happens now?" I asked again, though the question felt different this time. Less about escape, more about direction. Adrian took a slow step closer, but still maintained distance. "Now," he said, "you see what the structure reacts like when it is interrupted." I frowned slightly. "And what does that mean for me?" A brief pause followed. Not dramatic, just precise. "It means," he said, "you are no longer a variable that can be treated as invisible." That sentence shifted something inside me. Not fear exactly. Awareness. I looked at him carefully. "So I am visible now," I said quietly. "To who?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved briefly toward the door, then back to me. "To everyone who benefits from you not understanding the system you were placed inside," he said. The room felt smaller after that, though nothing physically had changed. I took a slow breath, trying to steady the rising realization that this was no longer about a contract, or even a marriage arrangement I had rejected. It was about attention, about consequence, about being seen inside something I never knew existed. "And you," I said carefully, "where do you stand in all of this?" Adrian met my gaze directly. "I stand where I always have," he said. "Inside it." And for the first time, I understood that locking the door had never been about preventing my escape. It had been about ensuring that what I had begun to see could no longer be unseen. The moment I said those words out loud, I realized I could no longer pretend this was just a misunderstanding of circumstances. It means you are no longer a variable that can be treated as invisible. That sentence stayed with me as I stood in the locked room, watching Adrian Cole with a level of attention I had never used before in my life. The idea that I had been invisible inside a system I never even knew existed was not something my mind could accept easily, but it also explained too many things at once to ignore. The silence between us did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, like even silence had meaning inside this place. I finally broke it. "If I am not invisible anymore," I said slowly, "then what happens when people notice me?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked back toward the glass wall, looking out at the distant skyline of Chicago as if the answer was written somewhere, outside the room rather than inside it. "They do not react to individuals," he said at last. "They react to disruption." I frowned slightly. "And I am a disruption now?" He turned his head slightly toward me. "You became one the moment the contract was torn." I looked down again, almost instinctively, at the empty space where the paper had once been whole. It no longer felt like a simple refusal. It felt like a trigger point I had not understood at the time of making it. "So what does that mean for me practically?" I asked. "Am I in danger?" The word came out before I could filter it, and I immediately regretted how human it sounded in a room that was not responding to emotion. Adrian finally looked directly at me again. "Danger is not always immediate or visible," he said. "Sometimes it is structural pressure. Sometimes it is observation. Sometimes it is removal of protection you did not realize you had. I crossed my arms, not out of defiance now, but out of instinctive self-stabilization. You keep talking about systems and structures, I said. But you are still not telling me who is actually behind it. There was a pause. Not hesitation but calculation. That is because naming them is not the first step, he said. Understanding how you are connected to them is. I shook my head slightly. That does not help me feel any safer. Safety was never the starting condition, he replied calmly. That answer should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it clarified something I had been avoiding. Nothing about my situation had ever been stable. I had only believed it was until it collapsed. I walked a few steps closer to the table again, looking at the torn pieces of the contract as if they might reassemble themselves into something I could interpret differently. If I had signed it, I said quietly, would I have been safer? Adrian's gaze did not move away from me. No, he said. The certainty in that single word made my stomach tighten slightly. Then what was it for? I asked. He stepped away from the window slowly, returning closer to the center of the room but still maintaining distance. It was a boundary marker, he said. A way to define visibility, responsibility, and access. I frowned. That sounds like I was being placed, not protected. You were both, he replied. The contradiction made my thoughts slow down. I realized I was no longer arguing with him. I was trying to understand a framework that operated outside of normal logic. So where do I stand now? I asked. Adrian paused for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice remained steady but more deliberate. Nowhere defined yet, he said. That is why this moment matters. I looked at him carefully. And you are still choosing to keep me here, inside this room, inside this conversation? He nodded once. Yes. There was no apology in the answer, but there was also no hostility. Just intention. I took a slow breath, realizing the locked door was no longer the most important detail in the room. It was the fact that I had stopped asking how to leave and started asking what I was becoming. And that realization changed everything I thought I knew about control, choice, and the space between them. The longer I stayed in the room, the more I realized silence was not empty here. It was intentional. It was structured in a way that forced awareness rather than allowing escape. I stood near the table where the torn pieces of the contract still lay scattered, their presence now feeling less like paper and more like evidence of something irreversible. Adrian Cole remained near the center of the room, not approaching, not retreating, simply existing within a controlled distance that made every movement between us feel measured. I finally spoke again because not speaking felt like surrendering understanding I had not yet fully formed. You keep saying I am not invisible anymore, I said. My voice was steadier now, though not calmer. But I still do not understand what visibility actually changes. Adrian turned his head slightly toward me. It changes how decisions are made around you, he said. I frowned. That does not sound like an improvement. It is not meant to sound like one, he replied. The honesty of that response made me pause. I looked at him more carefully now, not as someone trying to intimidate me, but as someone trying to observe how far my understanding had expanded in a very short amount of time. So what exactly changed the moment I tore the contract? I asked. Adrian took a slow step toward the table, his gaze briefly lowering to the torn paper before returning to me. You removed a layer of assumption, he said. That contract represented agreement. Once it was destroyed, agreement could no longer be assumed. That forces recalculation. I shook my head slightly. You are talking about me like I am part of a system, not a person. For the first time, there was a subtle shift in his expression, something closer to acknowledgement than correction. Inside systems like this, he said, individual identity and system position are not separate concepts. I let out a quiet breath, trying to process that without letting it overwhelm me. Then what am I positioned as now? I asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the glass wall again, looking out at the city below as if distance helped organize thought. You are not positioned yet, he said finally. You are transitioning from assumption to awareness. I crossed my arms again, though the gesture felt weaker this time. That sounds like I am being evaluated. He turned slightly back toward me. You are being observed, he corrected. Evaluation implies judgment. Observation implies adjustment. The distinction should have comforted me, but instead it made everything feel more precise, and precision was not something I associated with safety anymore. I looked at the door briefly, still locked, still silent. If I ask to leave now, I said slowly, what happens? Adrian's answer came without delay. You can leave this room, he said, but not what you have already entered into understanding. I frowned. That sounds like a contradiction. It is reality, he replied. I took a step back, processing how quickly the language of this conversation had shifted from emotional to structural. Nothing he said sounded like manipulation. That was what made it harder to dismiss. I walked slowly back toward the center of the room, stopping at a point where I could see both him and the scattered contract pieces at the same time. If I am no longer invisible, I said, then who is watching me now? Adrian's gaze remained steady. People who only react when systems change, he said. I felt a slight tightening in my chest, not fear exactly but awareness of scale. And what do they want? I asked. He paused for a moment before answering. They want stability restored, he said, or disruption contained. The words hung in the air without urgency, but their meaning was heavy enough to shift the atmosphere again. I looked at him carefully. And where do you fit into that? I asked. Adrian did not hesitate this time. I am part of the structure that manages both outcomes, he said. I held his gaze for a moment longer, trying to reconcile what that meant for everything I had experienced so far. The contract, the locked door, the silence, the controlled explanations. None of it felt random anymore. So this was never about a contract, I said quietly. Adrian's expression remained unchanged. No, he said. It was about whether you were going to remain unseen inside a system that had already accounted for you. And in that moment, I understood that the room I was standing in was not the boundary. It was the beginning of the part of my life where boundaries no longer meant what I thought they did. The silence that followed felt different from the silence before. Earlier, it had been uncertainty, tension, and the weight of not understanding. Now it felt like structure settling into place after being disturbed. I stood still in the center of the room, aware that nothing about my situation was returning to normal, because normal no longer existed in the way I used to define it. Adrian Cole remained near the glass wall, his presence steady and unchanged, as if the conversation had reached a point where further emotional reaction was no longer necessary. I finally broke the silence again, because the absence of clarity was becoming harder to endure than the discomfort of asking questions. So what happens to me now? I asked. My voice was quieter this time, less defensive, more searching. Adrian did not turn immediately. He continued looking out toward the city for a moment longer before responding. That depends on what you choose to understand from here, he said. I frowned slightly. That is not an answer that tells me anything concrete. He turned back toward me slowly. It is the only answer that matters at this stage, he replied. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady my thoughts. You keep talking about stages, I said, as if my life has been divided into parts one was never informed about. Adrian walked back toward the center of the room, stopping at a measured distance. It has, he said simply. The directness of that response made me pause. There was no hesitation in his tone, no attempt to soften it. It was stated as fact, not opinion. I looked at him carefully. Then explain what stage I am in now, I said. He studied me for a moment, as if evaluating not my question, but my readiness for the answer. You are in the stage where awareness replaces assumption, he said. I shook my head slightly. That still sounds like I am being guided rather than informed. Those two things are not always separate, he replied. I looked down briefly at the torn pieces of the contract again, still scattered across the floor like evidence of a decision that could not be undone. If tearing that contract changed my status, I said slowly, then what exactly did I become? Adrian did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone remained calm but more precise. You became acknowledged, he said. I frowned. Acknowledged by who? He held my gaze. By the system that no longer assumes your compliance. The words made the room feel even more contained, not physically but conceptually. I began to understand that compliance was not something expected of me in this moment. Observation was. So I am being watched, I said quietly. Adrian did not deny it. You are being recognized, he corrected. I exhaled slowly, trying to separate the difference between those two ideas. Recognition sounded less threatening than surveillance, but it carried its own weight. And you are part of that recognition process, I said. It was not a question. Adrian nodded once. Yes, he said. I looked at him for a long moment, trying to understand where control ended. An explanation began. Why me? I asked finally. The question felt more personal than anything I had said so far. Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not into emotion but into focus. Because your situation intersected with a decision that was never meant to be visible from your position, he said. I frowned again. My position was employment, I said. A contract job. That is all I knew. That is what you were told, he replied. The distinction made my thoughts slow down again. I walked a few steps, not toward escape but toward processing. So everything I thought I understood was incomplete, I said. Not incorrect, Adrian corrected. Incomplete. I stopped walking and looked back at him. That is a very careful way of saying I was kept out of the truth. It is a precise way of saying it, he replied. The honesty in his tone was unsettling in its consistency. There was no attempt to persuade me, only to define. I took a slow breath. If I leave this room, I said, do I return to what I thought my life was? Adrian paused briefly. No, he said. That single word carried more certainty than anything else in the conversation. I nodded slightly, absorbing it. So there is no return, I said. There is only continuation. Yes, he replied. I looked at him carefully again, realizing that nothing about this situation was designed to be temporary. The contract, the lock, the conversation, the explanations, they were not isolated events. They were part of a transition I had already entered without realizing it. Then what am I supposed to do with this awareness? I asked. Adrian stepped slightly closer, just enough to be present without imposing. You decide how much of it you are willing to carry, he said. I stood there for a moment, understanding finally settling in a way that felt irreversible. The door was still locked. The room was still sealed. But the real threshold was no longer behind me. It was inside. Everything I now understood could not be unseen. The room no longer felt like it was holding me against my will. It felt like it was holding me inside an understanding I could not yet step out of. The silence between Adrian Cole and me had changed. Again, becoming less about tension and more about structure. As if every unanswered question had created a new layer of awareness I was now forced to stand on. I took a slow breath, realizing that my earlier instinct to focus on the locked door had been replaced by something far more unsettling. The door no longer mattered as much as what existed beyond it in terms of consequence. You keep saying I have awareness now, I said quietly, breaking the stillness again. My voice sounded more controlled than I expected. But awareness without direction feels like another form of control. Adrian looked at me for a moment before responding. There was no resistance in his expression, only attention, as if he was measuring not my words, but the stage I had reached in understanding them. Control implies limitation without choice, he said finally. What you are experiencing is exposure to choice you did not previously recognize. I frowned slightly. That sounds like a very refined way of saying I was kept uninformed. It is a precise way of saying you were not positioned to see it, he replied. The distinction lingered uncomfortably in my mind. I walked slowly toward the table again, my gaze falling once more on the torn contract. The paper no longer represented defiance alone. It represented a shift in structure I had not fully understood when I made the decision. When I tore this, I said, I thought I was rejecting something imposed on me. Adrian stepped closer, though still maintaining a deliberate distance. You were, he said. But rejection inside structured systems is never isolated. It creates recalibration. I looked up at him. Recalibration for who? He answered without hesitation. For everyone connected to the structure you intersected with. The words made my thoughts slow down again, not from confusion this time, but from the realization of scale. I was not reacting to a single decision anymore. I was inside something that responded outwardly, So my life is no longer just mine, I said quietly. Adrian did not correct me immediately. That silence was its own form of confirmation. Your choices are now observable within a wider framework, he said at last. I exhaled slowly, trying to process what that meant without letting it overwhelm me. And you are part of that framework, I said. It was not a question anymore. He nodded once. Yes. I studied him more carefully now, noticing how consistent he remained under every shift in conversation. There was no urgency in him, no attempt to push me toward acceptance. Only continuity. If I had signed the contract, I said slowly, would I have avoided all of this? Adrian shook his head slightly. No, he said. You would have delayed recognition, not avoided it. That answer made something inside me tighten. So there was never a version of this where I was outside of it, I said. Only versions where I was unaware. Correct, he replied. I turned away slightly, letting the weight of that realization settle without interruption. The city outside the glass wall remained distant and indifferent, moving as if nothing inside this room could affect it, even though I was beginning to understand that assumption might not be accurate. What happens now? I asked again, though the question felt different this time. Less about escape, more about position. Adrian stepped back toward the window, looking out briefly before responding. Now you stabilize your understanding, he said. I frowned. That is not an action I know how to take. It is not an action, he corrected. It is a process. I looked at him again. And during this process I remain inside this room? Adrian turned slightly toward me. You remain where understanding is still forming, he said. I nodded slowly, realizing that the locked door was no longer the boundary I was concerned with. The boundary now existed in my comprehension. So the real shift is not what I did, I said quietly. It is what I now know. Adrian's gaze remained steady. Yes, he said. I stood still for a moment longer, letting that confirmation settle fully. Nothing had physically changed in the room, yet everything felt redefined. The contract was torn. The door was locked. But neither of those actions carried the weight they once did. The real shift had already happened internally, in the space where certainty used to exist without question. And for the first time I understood that leaving this room would not return me to my life. It would return me to a world that now expected me to see it differently. The realization did not arrive as a single moment, but as a gradual alignment of everything I had heard since the beginning of this conversation. Standing in the same locked room, I now understood that nothing about my presence here had been random, and nothing about Adrian Cole's explanations had been improvised. They had been structured, layered, and deliberately paced to match how much I was able to understand at each step. That understanding did not make me feel safer. It made everything feel more intentional. I finally spoke again, breaking the long silence that had settled between us. So every answer you have given me, I said quietly, was based on what I was capable of understanding at that moment. Adrian did not hesitate. Yes, he replied. I nodded slightly, not because I agreed, but because I was beginning to see the pattern forming too clearly to ignore. Then I was never actually being informed fully, I said. I was being guided incrementally. He looked at me for a moment before responding. Information without context is noise, he said. Context without timing is rejection. The structure of his answer made me pause. It was not emotional. It was procedural. I turned slightly away from him, looking at the glass wall again, where the city outside continued moving without awareness of anything happening inside this room. That means everything I have learned so far, I said slowly, was controlled exposure. Adrian stepped closer, not invading space, but reducing distance enough to ensure clarity. It was calibrated exposure, he corrected. I exhaled softly, trying to process the difference. Why does that matter so much? I asked. He paused briefly before answering. Because uncontrolled understanding leads to collapse, he said. I frowned. Collapse of what? Of perception, he replied. That answer should have sounded abstract, but it did not. It sounded like a warning disguised as explanation. I looked back at him more carefully now, realizing that his role in all of this was not to persuade me or to control me directly, but to regulate what I was allowed to see in sequence. So when you say I am not invisible anymore, I said. You mean I am now fully inside that sequence? Adrian nodded once. Yes. I walked slowly toward the center of the room again. My thoughts no longer scattered, but assembling into something more structured and uncomfortable. Then what happens when the sequence is complete? I asked. The question hung in the air longer than the others. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the scattered contract pieces on the floor again, as if the answer was partially contained there. Completion is not the end, he said finally. It is recognition of position. I frowned slightly. That does not sound like freedom. Freedom is not the framework being discussed, he replied calmly. I looked at him more directly now, no longer trying to interpret him emotionally but structurally. Then what is? I asked. Adrian met my gaze without hesitation. Alignment, he said. The word stayed in the room longer than I expected. I repeated it quietly. Alignment with what? He took a slow breath before answering, his tone unchanged. With what you now know cannot be unseen. I looked down again, not at the contract, but at my own hands, realizing how quickly my definition of choice had shifted since entering this room. I had thought tearing paper was an act of freedom. I was beginning to understand it may have been the moment I became part of something that required awareness instead of escape. If I refuse to align, I asked slowly, what happens then? Adrian did not move closer or change expression. Then you remain misaligned, he said. I frowned. That is not an answer. It is the only one that exists at this stage, he replied. I stood still, realizing that every stage he mentioned was not theoretical. It was sequential. And I was moving through it whether I agreed to or not. The locked door behind me no longer felt like the boundary. It felt like confirmation that I was no longer outside of anything. I was inside the structure now, not as a participant by choice but as an element already accounted for. And for the first time I understood that the real question was not whether I could leave this room. It was whether I could ever return to the version of myself that believed I was ever outside of it. The final stage of understanding did not arrive as clarity all at once. It arrived as exhaustion from trying to separate what I felt from what I was being shown. Standing in the same locked room, I no longer focused on whether I could leave, because that question had slowly become irrelevant. Instead, I focused on what remained consistent in everything Adrian Cole had said from the beginning. Structure, sequence, exposure, alignment. Each word he used was not emotional but procedural, as if my entire experience had been mapped in stages I was only now able to recognize. I finally broke the silence again, though my voice was quieter than before. So this is the end of the sequence, I said. Adrian did not correct me immediately. That alone told me the answer carried weight. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping at a distance that felt deliberate, not casual. It is not the end, he said. It is the point where continuation becomes conscious. I frowned slightly. That sounds like another way of saying I do not get to go back. You never had a version of going back, he replied. The simplicity of his answer made my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. I looked down at the floor for a moment, then back at him. Then what was I before this? I asked. Adrian paused briefly, as if choosing the most precise formulation rather than the most comforting one. You were unpositioned, he said. I repeated the word quietly. Unpositioned. He nodded once. Outside awareness of structure does not mean outside structure itself, he added. I exhaled slowly, letting that settle. It was not something I could immediately reject because too much of what I had experienced already aligned with it. I walked a few steps, not toward the door, but simply to create space for thought. The locked door no longer felt symbolic of confinement. It felt like confirmation that the conversation had moved beyond physical boundaries entirely. So what am I now? I asked. Adrian watched me carefully before answering. You are positioned within awareness, he said. I frowned slightly. That sounds like I have been assigned a place. It is not assignment, he replied. It is recognition of where you already are. I stopped walking and looked at him directly. And if I reject that recognition? I asked. There was a brief pause, not dramatic but precise. Then you remain in conflict with structure you cannot yet see fully, he said. I let out a quiet breath. realizing how carefully every answer avoided emotional framing, while still leaving no space for reversal. So there is no version of this where I return to ignorance, I said. Adrian did not deny it. Ignorance is not reversible once awareness has been established, he said. The words were not harsh, but they were final in a way that required no emphasis. I stood still for a moment, absorbing what that actually meant. Everything I had experienced, from the contract to the locked door to the conversation itself, had been guiding me toward a point where my understanding could no longer collapse back into what it was before. I looked at him again, more steadily now. Then what happens after awareness? I asked. Adrian stepped slightly closer, though still maintaining distance that felt intentional rather than defensive. After awareness, he said, comes decision under understanding rather than assumption. I nodded slowly, realizing that this was the first time the word decision carried real weight in a way it had not before. Not because I had more options, but because I now understood what options actually meant in context. I looked toward the glass wall again, at the city that continued moving without interruption. So the world outside this room is still the same, I said quietly. Adrian followed my gaze. Yes, he replied. But your interpretation of it is not. I turned back to him, and for the first time since entering this room, I understood something without needing further explanation. Nothing about my circumstances had changed externally in a way others would immediately notice. But internally, I was no longer operating under the same assumptions that had defined my life before this moment. The contract was torn. The door was locked. But the real shift had never been either of those things. It had been the point where I stopped believing I was outside of the structure at all. And now, standing in the aftermath of that realization, I understood that the conversation was no longer about escape. It was about what kind of reality I was willing to remain conscious inside of.